In my last video, I mentioned that my son was sick, and it finally got around to me. I'm not feeling my best, so deal with it. Speaking of my son, I was annoyed by something in his Common Core history. In his social studies book, the authors spend inordinate amounts of time on Jim Crow in the South and give the impression that whites were allowed to vote and blacks weren't. What they leave out is that from the nation's inception, 92% of whites couldn't vote either. Let me explain this with the word of the day. Timocracy. T-I-M. Timocracy. That's a form of government in which possession of property is required to vote or hold office. Early America, even under the British colonial system, was a timocracy. You had to have a certain amount of land to participate in government. There was a certain logic to it. Those with land paid taxes that others didn't. Since they were the ones funding government, it made sense that they were the ones who would have some say in the decisions that were made regarding it. After all, it was their money. Think of it like this. If 6 people chipped in for a pizza and demanded 1/6 of the pizza, should a 7th person who didn't donate get a slice? John Stuart Mill, in Considerations on Representative Government, talks about the dangers of universal voting in his native England. To stave off the dangers, he suggests certain reforms. For instance, he said that ordinary people should get 1 vote. People educated in political science should get 2 votes, and those who are illiterate or on welfare within the past 5 years should get no vote. He correctly said that if this third class voted, they would unethically vote themselves other people's money, which is exactly what happened. This is, of course, a staple of democracy. We've pointed to this quote before, but it bears repeating. Alexander Fraser Tytler said, "A democracy is always temporary in nature. It simply cannot exist as a permanent form of government. A democracy will continue to exist up until the time that voters discover that they can vote themselves generous gifts from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates who promise the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that every democracy will finally collapse due to loose fiscal policy, which is always followed by a dictatorship." Our founding fathers, of course, didn't want their republic to degrade into a democracy. They had just watched the French Revolution and how its democracy degraded into the reign of terror with guillotines. Think about today, where you have left-wing activists intimidating a jury to make sure that they vote the right way. That's your legal system on democracy. The founders hated the idea of mob rule and considered democracy what we call socialism today. That's what Aristotle's word was for it. He said that in a democracy, demagogues arise, bribing their way into power by promising free food, free housing, and free healthcare. This is in his book Politics, written thousands of years ago. To avoid socialism, or as they called it, democracy, they tried to install certain fail-safe mechanisms. They wanted to limit it to one branch of government, the House of Representatives. This was the only branch that had direct popular elections. Senate and the presidency were a step removed from popular elections, installed in a 2-step process so that they were more aristocratic in nature. The founders knew that if democracy overtook the Senate and presidency, then what happened in the French Revolution might happen in America. Long story short, the founding fathers did not believe in universal voting and mass democracy, nor did we have it in every part of the republic. Every state, in their own state constitutions, had property requirements to even be able to vote, effectively disenfranchising 92% of the white populace. Billionaire financier Bernard Baruch had a father who served in the Confederacy in the Civil War. In his autobiography, My Own Story, he wrote that disenfranchising whites while allowing blacks to vote was a tool of northern oppression in the South. He recounted, "Through much of my childhood, no white man who had served in the Confederate Army was allowed to vote, while all Negroes could vote, even though few could write their names. Our state senator was a Negro, as was the county auditor and school commissioner, although at the county level, never more than a third of the officials were Negroes. Still, the declared intention of the black Republicans in Washington was to make this state of affairs perpetual." Are our kids taught this in their Common Core social studies books, that most of the white population was disenfranchised in the South? Of course not. The authors of these textbooks see it as their job to mislead the kids and frame the situation in terms of black versus white. It was more about commoners than Common Core. Blacks after the Civil War were used as stalking horses by northern politicians to scam the voting system, to stack the deck as it were. It's why women were also eventually extended the vote. These cynical politicians didn't care about blacks or women per se. They were just useful new voting blocks used by unscrupulous hucksters who had no popular support. They couldn't change minds, so they decided to change the voters. As universal voting came in, we slid from a republic to a democracy. Universal voting is the fiat currency of representative government. As the vote was extended to everyone, its power was diluted. As I said, 92% of whites couldn't vote from the very beginning of the country, yet you'd never know this from reading the fake history in the schools today. What was a class issue was repackaged as a racial one by people bent on dividing and sabotaging our country. We live in a world filled with fear and intimidation so that the truth won't be spoken. Presented by The New American, The Ben Armstrong Show says the things that others are afraid to say. Find information and truth to arm you against the lies. Watch every weekday on thenewamerican.com.